All right. Welcome to 2014 World Space Week. I'd like to welcome, we have Miss Shanley's classroom at Schaefer Elementary and Mr. Granger's classroom at North School, also in Villa Park. So welcome to you guys. We are going to have a great time where we're going to hear from a special guest. Now, here in Colorado Springs, the Space Foundation, we have invited Dr. Leroy Chiao to come and share his experiences as an astronaut in space 4 times. Now, Dr. Chiao is based in Houston, and he's Space Foundation's special advisor to human spaceflight. His space shuttle missions include STS-92 on the Space Shuttle Discovery, STS-72 Space Shuttle Endeavour, and the STS-65 on the Space Shuttle Columbia. So he's been able to fly on 3 different Space Shuttle missions. Now, additionally, he has also been able to take a ride on the Soyuz rocket, taking TMA-5, where he was the commander for 6 months on the International Space Station. So we would like to welcome Dr. Leroy Chiao, and at the end of his presentation, we will have some time for some questions, which I have here from your classrooms. So would you guys please welcome Dr. Leroy Chiao?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Elias, and welcome Villa Park. Nice to be talking to you today from the Space Foundation here in Colorado Springs. As you heard, my name is Leroy Chiao. I'm the special advisor for human spaceflight for the Space Foundation, and I'm also an astronaut. And so what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about myself and how I got interested in space, share some of my adventures with you, and then we'll answer some questions that you've prepared for about where we're going and what we're going to be doing. You can see Mars back here and back of me, so that gives you a little bit of an idea. Well, I've always been interested in flying and airplanes and space. I can't remember a time when I wasn't building models or reading books about them, and I made a bunch of model rockets when I was a kid and launched them, and we landed on the moon. Apollo 11 landed on the moon when I was an 8-year-old kid, so I was in 3rd grade. And I remember like it was yesterday watching the old black and white TV set and listening to the transmissions coming back and with all the excitement and just listening to that as they called off, as they were approaching the surface of the moon, and then they actually landed. And I remember that moment very clearly. And that's when the dream started for me of wanting to become an astronaut myself. And so I worked very hard in school. I knew I had to do well in school and get good grades so that I could go to college, go study at university. I studied engineering because I was always interested in technical things anyway, so it was kind of a natural path for me to take. And you know, after I finished those degrees, I was working for a while, first in an aerospace materials company, and then at a government laboratory at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and that's when I put my application in to NASA. And that was a very exciting time. I remember putting the application in and then just trying to forget about it because, you know, that's about all you can do. 7 months after I put the application in, they called me. I got a call from NASA inviting me to come to Houston for a week to interview and have a big medical exam. And that was sure exciting just to have made that first cut. I remember going down to Houston, not really sure what to expect. Most of the week was actually a medical exam. They tested everything. If you've seen that old movie, The Right Stuff, it's kind of like that. After that, it was another waiting game. I had waited another 4 months while they made their selections, and then I got that very exciting call inviting me to come to Houston to join the next astronaut group. That was really, as you can imagine, just a thrilling time. I packed my bags. I was living in California at the time, moved to Houston, where I've now lived for 24 years. I spent actually 15 years at NASA, and during that time I did have the chance to fly 4 times in space. As you heard, my first 3 missions were aboard space shuttles, and on my 4th mission I trained with the Russians. I flew on a Russian Soyuz, and then I was the commander of the International Space Station for 6.5 months. So after arriving at NASA, it's kind of like going back to school. We had to learn all about NASA. We were a bunch of people from a lot of different places. We came from, there were research engineers like me. We had military test pilots from the different services. We had a couple of medical doctors and a couple of physicists. and we all had to come together and start training together and learning about NASA, learning about the space shuttle. It's pretty much like going back to school, because even though we were working professionals with our degrees and everything, we had to learn about NASA, and we had to learn space shuttle systems. So we sat in classrooms, very much like you do. We listened to lectures, we took notes, we had tests, we went on field trips, we went to the different NASA centers to see how everything fit together, see different components being made or for different spacecraft, watching rockets and space shuttles being prepared for launch. And then we started getting assigned to missions, and so that was very exciting. I got assigned to my first mission a couple of years after having joined NASA, and 2 years later I got my first chance to fly aboard Space Shuttle Columbia. So that was a very exciting time, as you can imagine. I'd been dreaming about that moment since I was an 8-year-old kid, and then finally getting into space all those years later was just the dream come true. We were a science mission, so we had a space lab in the back, a module called Space Lab. This is before we had an International Space Station, so this is how we did scientific research back then. It was a 2-week mission, and we accomplished over 80 different experiments. On my second mission, I got to go fly on Space Shuttle Endeavour, and the big deal for me there was this first chance I had to put the big white spacesuit on and go outside and do my first 2 spacewalks. And what we were doing, we were testing tools and construction techniques on how we would later build the International Space Station. So we were figuring out how we're going to do that big station, how we're going to split all the missions up, spacewalks we were going to have to do, what tools we were going to have to develop, and so it was really an exciting time. A few years later, I got assigned to my 3rd mission aboard Space Shuttle Discovery, where I actually got to go up and help build the station. We brought 2 pieces with us in the back of the shuttle. We used the robotic arm of the shuttle to install those pieces or to position them. And then over 4 spacewalks and 2 teams, we went outside and actually bolted those pieces down and mated the electrical connectors to bring them to life. After that, 10 years had gone by, and I had flown 3 space shuttle missions, and the chief astronaut asked me to join the Expedition Corps, and that was really kind of a changing of gears, because up until that point in my career, I'd been focused on how we were going to build the space station and 2-week shuttle missions and things like that, and now I was being asked to train to live and work aboard the station on what turned out to be a 6.5-month flight. That was very exciting. It was a big deal, though. I had to decide I wanted to live in space for 6.5 months. For you students out there, that's most of a school year. That's your school year is about 9 months, right? And so 6 months is about 2/3 of a school year. That's a long time to be basically in a few tin cans and living and working in space. So you've really got to think about it and decide that that's something you want to do. Once I decided I did want to accept that adventure, the training was quite a commitment. It was going to be 3.5 years. So that's almost enough to get another college degree. I was going to have to learn Russian. I had to learn a new language, and because I was going to be spending half of my time over there. Now, the Russians had to do the same thing. They had to spend half their time in Houston, and they had to learn English, and we were all going back and forth together. But Expedition 10 was really exciting. I got to fly on Soyuz TMA-5, launching out of Kazakhstan, and it'd be kind of neat. Go look on a map somewhere and see where Kazakhstan is and where the Aral Sea is. The launch site is east of the Aral Sea. And so we launched up to the space station, and we did a lot of scientific work up there, and we also did a lot of maintenance work. And so where are we going in the future? A few years ago, I was actually part of a White House appointed committee, and we looked at that question. We put together options for the then new administration. And there have been a few kind of false starts. If you've been following the news over the last several years, we've kind of gone in different directions, and unfortunately, the funding that was promised didn't really materialize, and so you've seen the program struggle a little bit. The good news is we are still building the next generation spacecraft now that the space shuttle has been retired 3 years ago. It's called Orion, and it's actually Lockheed Martin, which is just up the road from here up in Denver. They're the prime contractor for Orion. That vehicle is being designed so it can go farther than the space shuttle. The space shuttle could only go into low Earth orbit. Orion's going to go farther. It can go to the moon or beyond as part of a vehicle stack that we would assemble in orbit. We're building a new family of rockets called the Space Launch System, or SLS, and that'll launch Orion into low Earth orbit. It'll also launch other components of a deeper spacecraft, like an Earth departure stage, which is basically a big gas tank with rocket engines, and you would attach the Orion, maybe a lander if you're going to go land somewhere. We're working on something called the Asteroid Redirect Mission, where the plan is to robotically bring a small asteroid into orbit between the Earth and the Moon, and then use the Orion to go fly missions there. But the big goal, longer term, is to get to the red planet behind me, is to actually get astronauts out to the red planet. And so that's very exciting. We're not exactly sure when that's going to happen because the timetable hasn't been set. But one of you kids out there today watching, maybe one of you will be the first person on Mars. Wouldn't that be cool? A lot of commercial stuff going on too, and that's mostly some companies are being helped by NASA to develop a capability to launch astronauts to the International Space Station. But very exciting, at least one of those companies, SpaceX, its founder and chief executive officer, Elon Musk, has publicly said that he wants to go to Mars himself. And so he's thinking, as he develops these spacecraft, that he wants to send a spacecraft, at least several spacecraft, to Mars, and he wants to go there himself. And so that kind of throws a wild card in it. And so my message to you is that although we've had a little bit of a false start, there's an exciting future in human spaceflight exploration. So I think with that, the best thing to do would be open it up to your questions. We'll answer some of the questions that Elias has collected from you guys.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Chiao, very much for talking to us about space.
Sure.
It's like there. And we do have a couple of questions prepared to us. It looks like we have a few from Miss Davies' 4th grade class. The first question comes from Abigail, and she's asking, how would you describe the feeling of being in space?
You know, the feeling of being in space, you're basically weightless, okay? It's microgravity, which means there's very little gravity. The physics of that is a free fall. So it would be the same feeling as if you had jumped out of an airplane and you were free falling if there were no air friction. Okay, and you can kind of get that feeling on Earth when you're on a roller coaster, or if you're in one of those amusement park rides, it kind of drops. Now the difference is your eyes in those situations tells you that you're falling, and so that's why your stomach kind of feels like it's coming up into your throat, and you get that kind of a scary feeling. You don't get that when you're in space. The way we kind of do that on Earth is we use airplanes. We can fly what's called zero-G parabolas. So we're flying these airplanes as if they're doing a roller coaster ride. And when you're coming on the downside, think about it, you're kind of falling inside the airplane, but the airplane is falling at the same rate as you are. And so inside the airplane, you're floating. And that's real microgravity. Now, the reason your throat, you don't get your stomach feeling like you're coming up into your throat is because the airplane is falling at the same rate, and so you don't really, there are no windows, or the windows are blocked, so you're not seeing the outside. You don't know that you're in a dive. But if you're here on the Earth, the way to kind of get the feeling of what it's like to be in space is if you get into a swimming pool and you have like a goggles or a dive mask, and so you can see, and then you totally relax in the pool, you'll kind of float in the water, right? And so it'll kind of give you an idea of what it's like. The physics aren't correct because you still have gravity pulling on you, but that's kind of what it's like.
Right, excellent. That's a great question. And next question comes from Dora. What is your most memorable experience in space?
My most memorable experience in space, well, of course, there are a lot of memories in space. I spent almost 230 days in space, and a lot of that was doing work, but there were a lot of really neat, memorable moments too. I would say my favorite moment in space, I was doing a spacewalk. I was on my 3rd mission. I was helping to build the space station, and during that spacewalk, I had my boots attached to the robotic arm of the shuttle, and I was being moved from one part of the space station to another part, and it took several minutes to move me there. And during part of that transition, I was looking face down at the Earth through my helmet, and I couldn't see the space shuttle or the space station. I was looking straight at the Earth, and I was watching the clouds and the continents go by, and I felt like a satellite just flying over the Earth. And so that was probably the neatest moment.
Awesome. And before we go on to this last question, it looks like we have a little bit of extra time here at the end. And so if you would like to ask some live questions, go ahead and go up to your teacher's, your teacher's computer, and we're going to open it up to Miss Shanley's classroom first, followed by Mr. Granger's classroom. So be ready to go after Dr. Chiao answers this last question. All right, so this last question comes from Oliver, and Oliver is asking, what have you explored, and what are you hoping that people do explore someday?
Sure. All of my missions were in low Earth orbit, so if you look at a globe, if your classroom has a globe, or if you have one at home, and you measure out, say, about 250 or 300 miles, like the distance between two cities, and then you kind of hold your fingers above that globe, you'll see that in low Earth orbit, that's the altitude we were at. So we were just kind of skimming the surface of the Earth. Okay, we were in space, to be sure, but we weren't that far away. We were not like the Apollo astronauts who actually went to the moon, which is about 250,000 miles away. Okay, so we were only about 250, 300 miles up. And so we got to see a good part of the Earth, but we could never see the entire Earth at once. And so the research work that we did, the exploration that we did, was all around pretty close to Earth, especially on the space station. We're during the long flight. We did a lot of scientific investigation. So that was kind of the exploration that we did. Now, the exploration we're talking about is going farther, going what we call beyond low Earth orbit. And that's what the Orion is being designed to do, and that's what future missions are being developed to do. And so hopefully, in the not-too-distant future, we will be flying in what's called cislunar space, which is between the Earth and the Moon, maybe in formation with an asteroid that we've redirected into that space. And eventually, we want to be sending people to Mars. And so, I think my personal opinion is that we do need to go back to the Moon. So there'd be a neat opportunity for some people to go back to test things, test all the stuff that you're going to use for Mars, because you want to make sure your habitats and your rovers and your spacesuits, all that kind of thing, all those things are going to work before, find out all the problems before you send it off to Mars, because Mars is so far away. We talk about transit times to Mars, about 6 months one way. So just think about it. 6 months, the entire time I spent on the space station would be spent going to Mars or coming back from Mars.
Excellent, thank you. And we have a couple of minutes to see if there's any questions. We're going to open up the mic to Miss Shanley's classroom. What questions, Miss Shanley, do your students have for Dr. Chiao? And make sure that you unmute your mic. If you move your mouse on the picture, you'll see a mic on the top. So go ahead and give us your question, Miss Shanley.
Hi, my name is Callista, and I was wondering, what is your favorite thing to do when you go up?
What is my favorite what? Say it again.
What is your favorite thing to do when you go up into space?
What is my favorite thing to do when I go up? My favorite thing to do in space are spacewalks. Now, that's a lot of hard work, but it's also the neatest thing that I've done up there. Getting to put the spacesuit on and going outside, it's basically like putting on a personal spacecraft, because inside the spacesuit you've got pressure, you've got oxygen, you've got a cooling system that kind of regulates the temperature, you've even got some drinking water, and so you've got everything you need to basically go outside and work for 6 or 7 hours. And so it's kind of a personal spacecraft. You're out there all by yourself. You can see your buddies. And when we were flying space shuttles, you could see your buddies inside the back window and wave at them, but you're very much on your own. So it's a little bit of a weird feeling, a little bit of a surreal feeling, and it's also hard work, because if you think about it, if you're working in a pressurized spacesuit, you're working inside a balloon. So every time you move your arms or your fingers, you're actually having to use energy, your strength, to do that. And so we actually have physical trainers, and so they make sure that we're in good shape, good enough shape to do all this before we go fly our missions.
Hi, my name is Emiliano, and I want to know how you breathed in space.
How do we breathe in space? Well, pretty much like you do here on the Earth. That's why we have to have spacecraft and space suits, and so they can maintain a pressure and enough oxygen so that you can, stay healthy. And so on a space station or on a spacecraft, we maintain 1 atmosphere of pressure, which is basically the pressure that's at sea level. And so here in Colorado Springs, we're pretty high. We're about a mile up, and so the pressure's a little bit lower here, but Houston, where I live, and probably Villa Park is probably pretty close to sea level. And that's the same pressure that you would have on a spacecraft. Now, when you go into a spacesuit, we want the pressure to be lower because, as I was describing, it takes strength to move your arms and your fingers, and the more pressure there is, the more strength it takes. And so we actually drop the pressure down to about 1/3 of what it is at sea level, and then we increase the amount of oxygen to 100%. That is, we're flowing pure oxygen into the spacesuit, and that allows us to get enough oxygen to breathe, but still being able to move our arms and our fingers. So you breathe pretty much normally, pretty much like you do here on Earth. Now, the interesting thing about being in a spacesuit at that lower pressure, you feel the same because you're getting the same amount of oxygen, but at that lower pressure, you can't whistle. You can try to whistle. It's kind of fun to try to whistle, but you can't because you're not moving enough molecules through your lips to be able to make a noise like that.
Hi, my name is Tabitha, and I was wondering, is it fun being in space?
Is it fun being in space? It's a blast being in space. It's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of hard work too. The best part about being in space is looking back at the Earth and taking pictures. The colors are very bright and vivid, and if you've ever had a chance to see one of the IMAX movies, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, please, hopefully you will have a chance to go to a museum nearby and see one of the IMAX movies. That'll give you an idea of what it's like to look back at the Earth.
Good. We have just a few more minutes to hear from Mr. Granger's classroom. So if Mr. Granger can unmute his mic, are there any questions in his room?
We got someone coming up now.
Okay.
Do you guys have hyperspeed?
Do we have hyperspeed? Boy, I wish we had hyperspeed to get to Mars like that. You know, Mars is so far away, like I was saying, it'll take 6 months or so to get there using the kinds of technology that we have today. Now, that means when we go to Mars, we're talking about like 40,000 miles an hour. Just think about it, 40,000 miles an hour. That's pretty fast, right? And when you're driving in a car on the freeway where you're probably traveling around 60 miles an hour, now imagine 40,000 miles an hour, and it still takes 6 months or more to get from the Earth to Mars. So if we had a hyperdrive, if we had something like that, that would be really cool. Maybe you can invent one for us.
Okay, here's another one.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. Is it hard to leave behind your family?
Is it hard to leave behind your family? You know what? It is. And actually, during most of my astronaut career, I was a single guy. I wasn't married. I only got married a year before I went to the space station, and so we didn't have any kids yet. And it was hard enough just leaving my wife behind, and it would be extra hard to leave children behind too. And so, fortunately for me, I guess I never had to do that. But I know other people who have had children who left them to go train and also to go fly. In fact, it's probably harder to leave them for training because it was so long. It was 3.5 years. Every other month you're gone for a month, and I think it was difficult for them. But yeah, that certainly is a consideration.
And now too, though, with the communication technologies, right? The astronauts can email and Skype and do video conferences with their families too, right?
That's right. It's a lot better now. In low Earth orbit, we actually have internet access. You know, when I was there about 2 years ago, we didn't have internet access, but we could have email, but they would synchronize our inboxes every 8 hours so we could communicate. And when the antenna dish was pointed at the satellite, we could make short phone calls down. So that was all very nice. In the early days, when the Russians were flying space stations, they didn't have any of that back many years ago. And as we talk about going to Mars, it's so far away that it'll take minutes for a radio signal to reach a spacecraft approaching Mars and coming back. So you won't be able to have like a real-time conversation like this. It'll take somewhere between, depending on the alignment of the planets, anywhere from 6 minutes or so to even 30 or 40 minutes delay. So that's how far away Mars is.
Great, awesome. Well, it looks like we have Miss Chiarella's classroom, if I said that correct. Miss Chiarella's classroom, they come to us from Miami, Florida, and we have some questions that were sent to us by Miss Chiarella, and we wanted to answer these 3 questions from them before we finish our broadcast here. So, first question comes from Jade. Jade is asking, what was your favorite food in space?
My favorite food in space. You know, space food really is not that great. It's gotten better over the years. We use a lot of items from the military meals ready to eat. And because we don't have a refrigerator up there, so they can stay, they have a long shelf life. That means you can store them and they won't go bad for a long time. We also use a lot of canned items. The Russians have a lot of canned items. And what's kind of funny is I think you like something different. And so the Americans, most of us really like the Russian food, and the Russians really like the American food. So we kind of shared food. One of my favorites were Russians had this canned fish with tomato sauce in it that was really good for some reason. And also they had a really nice mashed potatoes made with onions and garlic and butter. So that was all really good.
I don't know if I would like that so much, but I hear the shrimp is pretty good.
Yeah, shrimp cocktail's good. It's nice and spicy. Some people say their taste buds don't seem to work as well in space, and so they like spicier foods.
Oh, Oh, sounds interesting for sure. Next question comes from Tatiana. At what time do you sleep when you are in space?
Well, everything is scheduled, as you can imagine, so we run off a clock just like you do here on Earth. What we don't have that regular sunrise and regular sunset at the right times on Earth because we're going around the Earth once every 90 minutes. So imagine having a sunset or a sunrise about every 45 minutes, so you can't depend on the lighting outside to tell you what time it is. You have to depend on your clocks. And so all the computers have clocks. You're wearing wristwatches usually. And so we run on something called Greenwich Mean Time, which Greenwich is in England, and it's a standard time used for aviation, and it's also kind of a compromise between Moscow time and Houston time where the two control centers are. And so we have a schedule, and we know exactly when we're supposed to be eating, exercising, working, and going to sleep.
Great question, Tatiana. And our last question is from Isabella. Isabella is asking, can you watch TV in space?
No, we can't watch TV in space, but we have pretty good DVD library, and they can also send up other shows. They can record shows and send them up for us to watch later. And so it's a little bit like YouTube, I guess. You can watch things that have been recorded, but we can't see anything live these days. The internet access on board, I don't believe, is quick enough to allow that. And even if it were, there's a lot of other high priority things that would take the bandwidth rather than allowing astronauts to stream TV shows and movies.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Chiao, for joining us, and thank you guys for linking in with us today. I hope that you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Chiao. And feel free to look us up on the internet at spacefoundation.org, and we would love to answer any more questions that you guys have. So thanks for joining us today, and hope that you have a great week. Talk to you later.
Hey guys, good luck. Thanks for joining us.